Hey, what's up, guys? Today, we're going to continue with China, and we got so much information to cover, it's going to be pretty mind-blowing. So make sure you check out China Unveiled Part 1 if you haven't seen it before watching this one. I want to give a shout out to Hathmis for the assistance, and KD for laying the groundwork. With that, let's get started. To begin, I wanted to talk about Fusang, which is an ancient Chinese legend, or really historical account, that referred to a mythical tree or location that was east of China. The tree is described as the Tree of Life, which has also been identified as a mulberry or hibiscus, which allegedly grew far to the east of China. An early account claims that in 219 BC, Emperor Shi Huang sent an expedition of some 3,000 convicts to a place which was located far off to the east, across the ocean, a place which was called Fusang, where they were required to make a sacrifice to a volcano god who held the elixir of life. I've heard it pronounced a few different ways, Fusang or Fusang, but apparently 2 expeditions were undertaken by Xu Fu, the court sorcerer, in order to seek the elixir of life. The first expedition returned 210 BC because Xu Fu claimed that a giant sea creature was blocking his men's path. Archers were sent to kill this monster when the expedition set out a second time, but it was never heard from again. A country, which was named Fusang, was described by the native Buddhist missionary Hui Xin in 499 AD, which was a place that is located 20,000 Chinese li to the east of Dahan, and it is also located to the east of China. Hui Xin arrived in China from Kabul in 450 AD and went by ship to Fusang in 458 AD, and upon his return in 499, reported his findings to the Chinese emperor. His descriptions are recorded in the 7th century text Book of Liang by Yao Silian, and it describes the civilization that inhabits the Fusang country. This Fusang, which is described by Shen, has been posited to be in the Americas, which is fascinating because this was a subject of great debate during the late 19th and 20th centuries after the 18th century writings of Joseph de Guignes were republished and disseminated by Charles Godfrey Leland in 1875. There are even maps that show that there was a Chinese colony in America before Columbus, and some maps depict Fusang as an island above California near British Columbia. Others show it as a large area on the west coast. Perhaps the landmass changed following a large disaster in the early 17th century. These early maps are extremely fascinating, and there's even a map that's dated from before the arrival of Columbus. How would the Chinese know what North America looked like if no one had traveled there before? This seems to be a huge cover-up, and in Leland's book from 1875, he lays out some interesting facts that seem to prove this theory. Quote, "It is now more than a century since the learned French sinologist de Guignes set forth the fact that he had found in the works of early Chinese historians a statement that, in the 5th century of our era, certain travelers of their race had discovered a country which they call Fusang, and which, from the direction and distances as described by them, appeared to be Western America, and in all probability, Mexico." End quote. But of course, de Guignes' work, even to the present day, is a subject of commendation among scholars. Now, some may think that the Chinese were not capable of traveling such great distances, but I thought this was pretty crazy. Look at the Chinese explorer Zheng He's ship compared to Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria, which they both lived and sailed at the same time. The Chinese also in mainstream history traveled great distances. Sure, they say it was just along the coast, but there have been experiments that have shown it was completely possible for them to sail from eastern China to the west of North America. Remember, so this voyage was done by Buddhist monks, and there have been artifacts found in America that point to this and are associated with the mound builders. Even some Mississippian figurines resemble Buddha, and it is called Monk's Mound. I'm sure you guys remember the Grand Canyon newspaper article that discussed finding mummies in the Grand Canyon. Well, according to Kincaid, it wasn't just Egyptian artifacts, there was also a large Buddha statue found as well, which seems like an interesting detail. Sure, the mainstream narrative is that this was all a hoax, but some of the formations in the Grand Canyon are named after temples and pyramids. There's even one that's called Buddha Temple. Why would you name it that? Seems random. Unless there's something we're not being told. There's another more recent newspaper article, but this one's from the New York Times in 2003, titled Goodbye Columbus, which is based on Gavin Menzies' research of Zheng He, who landed his ships in America. Now, the monks who traveled to America, or Fusang, did so thousands of years ago by Chinese accounts. But Zheng He was said to land in America in 1421, which is 70 years before Columbus arrived. I think that'd be great for its own video, but I figured I should mention it. But yeah, in the article Goodbye Columbus, Menzies claims that the Chinese were not only exploring the west coast, but also the east coast, and even traveling to the center of the continent. The article also mentions a Professor Niven that found a pre-Columbian Chinese corpse in Mexico. The skeletal corpse, discovered by William Niven in 1911, was found on an altar-like structure, but it was so old that the bones were to disintegrate on touch. The skull was of a Mongolian type, and the body was no taller than 5 feet with long arms. It wore around its neck a necklace of pearls of green jade, a substance that was alien to Mexico at the time. Beside the corpse was a 7-inch high-earthen statue known as the Little Chinaman for obvious reasons. The figurine was clothed and decorated in a Chinese style. The visage had slit eyes and had huge rings in his ears similar to those worn by the Chinese today. On his head he wore a skull cap with a tiny button in the center, which almost exactly corresponds to the caps worn by the mandarins of the empire. The find appears to be another strong indicator of China's pre-Columbian contact with Mexico. Menzies also mentions a 1507 map that depicts San Francisco Bay, which is pretty good evidence as the Waldseemüller world map is the first to chart latitude and longitude with precision. The Pacific coast of America is drawn on the map, and the latitudes correspond to those of Vancouver Island down to Ecuador in the south. San Francisco and Los Angeles are depicted at the correct latitudes on the chart. But how could California be accurately depicted before the first Europeans arrived to California? Also, interestingly, the Portuguese sailor Antonio Cavao was told about early Chinese voyages to the New World when he visited China in 1555, and he noted that the Chinese were lords of the Pacific coast of America. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Chinese were in the west coast of America, even stone remains. Did you know that there's apparently a wall of China in California, and they have no idea who built it? These are called the East Bay Walls, also known as the Berkeley Mystery Walls. They can be found in the hills surrounding the San Francisco Bay, and in some places are up to a meter high, built without mortar. There was even a History Channel video talking about lots of this stuff recently, which I thought was crazy because they're literally starting to talk about the same stuff that we're talking about in terms of early civilizations in America, and surprisingly no, they don't mention aliens. But they were comparing the East Bay Walls to certain areas of the Wall of China. Some of the oldest portions of the Wall of China have a close resemblance to the walls in California. Also, I thought this was very strange, but we all know about the Chinese who built the railroads. That's a common story in American history, but I didn't know about this. There's an area in Oregon with rock walls called Ahi Diggings, also known as the Chinese Wall, which supposedly were built by Chinese miners along the Granite Creek in 1867. I don't believe this story at all. Seems like a cover-up if you ask me. Then there's another China Wall in California. Not the one that we were talking about earlier. Completely different. And yeah, it looks very old and out of place. It's supposedly over 150 years old, and they even have a plaque that talks about this. It was constructed with fitted stones and no mortar. The tunnels were dug out of solid granite, and it was done with back-breaking labor. But I thought it was interesting that the plaque referred to these Chinese miners as the Asian master builders, who left an indelible mark on the history of California in the West. Master builders? I don't know if I believe that these Chinese immigrants were just building these railroads. The story goes that they were working around the clock, every day, all year long, for roughly 4 years until the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. But there's really no explanation for this wall, other than that they used the debris from digging out the tunnel. They say that it was to support the railroad tracks, but seems unnecessary to do it this way. And an up-close inspection of the wall shows that these rocks on the wall itself display an incredible mastership that still stands today. So we're just supposed to believe that this was done by Chinese immigrants who were treated horribly and were basically in slave-like conditions? And what's even crazier is this isn't the only one. As I was researching this, I came across another mysterious wall. This one, surprisingly, in a ghost town named Loop Loop in Washington State. Loop Loop City was the first town in Okanagan County to be planned, supposedly. There are no known pictures of the town, but this Loop Loop was once a bustling mining settlement that had 18 businesses and several streets. But this is pretty insane. There's this remain in the middle of nowhere called the Mysterious China Wall, and it's massive and looks very old. But they have this whole cover story of this ghost town to explain it, and that this wall was an Arlington Mill. It's a strange set of massive granite walls into Loop Loop country on the side of Ruby Hill, and for some reason people have decided to call it the China Wall. It's composed of huge blocks of granite tightly fitted with the corners perfectly squared. The largest of the 10 walls measures 80 feet long and 27 feet high. The second is 77 feet long and 20 feet high. Apparently there are some blocks that weigh slightly over a ton, and they expect us to believe that these massive walls were built using the block and tackle method, that it was some random mill, and yet nothing else of the ghost town seems to really survive. Okay, but listen to this. Quote, "Through the years, the massive granite walls have been shrouded in mystery and peppered with speculation. Somehow they have been linked with the Chinese. A number of local pioneers had heard that the Chinese were involved in construction of the walls. However, a sampling of the names of the Arlington Mill payroll records do not show any of the Chinese flavor. Nor does it appear that Scottish masons built the wall, which has been one of the most enduring rumors attached to the massive granite structure. The walls and the rest of the Arlington Mill were constructed by the only sort of workforce one might have expected to assemble in the raw, rugged Okanagan County of 1889. Miners, farmers, carpenters, masons, common laborers, and drifters." End quote. Okay, so the local lore is that it was the Chinese and Scottish masons that have something to do with this massive wall. Of course they would want to cover this up, as it wouldn't align with the story that we're told. Were they really building boom towns with this level of construction and then just abandoning them? Seems like something isn't right about this whole story. But let's go back to the railroads. There's some strangeness with this whole Union Pacific Railroad Company, responsible for part of the first transcontinental railroad in the West. Okay, so the original company was founded in 1862 under the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which supposedly was approved by Abraham Lincoln to ensure stability of the Union throughout the Civil War. So not only were they fighting a civil war, but they also had the time for a massive expansion of the already existing rail networks in the US. I mean, we're talking about 2,000 miles, which in the mainstream story, a significant portion of the labor force were Chinese immigrant workers. Interestingly, the Union Pacific Railroad Company somehow went bankrupt even though the project was said to be a success. Supposedly due to financial mismanagement in the Panic of 1873, they had to create a second company with the name Union Pacific Railway. But then once again they went bankrupt, this time due to the Panic of 1893, and started a new company which went back to the original railroad. This was the New Union Pacific Railroad Company. They have this unusual board game based on the New Union Pacific Railroad. It shows 45 beautifully executed views of places along the Union Pacific route from New York to San Francisco, the metropolis of California. But the cover of the board game is very interesting, which shows two women or gods shaking hands. The lady on the right is Libertas with a Phrygian cap holding an American shield. So this is the real Captain America, which goes back to Mithras. So Libertas represents America, But who is this other woman and what does she represent? Well, it seems to be referencing China in the West, as you can see in the background Chinese characters along with the Chinese men riding horses and pagodas in the background. It would seem that this is referencing San Francisco, as the train is pointing to the left, meaning it's arriving from its voyage, from New York to San Francisco. They want us to believe that this is what San Francisco looked like in 1870, but we have high quality photos from 1878 showing that it looked completely different. Unless they expect us to believe that this was all built in less than 8 years, which doesn't seem possible at all. Perhaps this 1870 board game served not only as propaganda, but also was embedded with a secret agreement between America and China? I mean, really, a board game? And some of these depictions are very interesting, showing bridges and other cities along the route. But how did we get to this cover with the pagodas? There are some interesting things about pagodas in the US, and they're sometimes included in the World Fairs. There was one supposedly made for the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, which is a Chinese pagoda located in Fairmount Park. There's a pagoda in Patterson Park, Baltimore, also known as the Patterson Park Observatory, which is said to have been built in 1891. Then there's also a Japanese tower in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, said to have been built in 1894. I really wonder if there were far more of these, and if they were just simply destroyed in order to maintain the narrative. But what are pagodas and what were they originally designed for? China is another term for ceramics or porcelain, and ceramics are typically used as an insulating material due to its non-conductivity, making it ideal for preventing unwanted electrical currents passing between different components. Check this out. This is a porcelain pagoda or Tower of Nanjing. Now this is insane. So this was apparently constructed in the 15th century during the Ming Dynasty. And we'll talk about this in a future episode, but it was destroyed during this insane rebellion that it's its own rabbit hole. But Nanjing used to be the capital of China during the Ming Dynasty. Now look at the original depictions. It definitely looks like some type of generator. Look at the ornamentation and even the device at the top. Are pagodas actually some type of tech for extracting energy from the atmosphere? Perhaps a mercury arc rectifier was used, which is used for converting high current into a direct current. It uses a pool of liquid mercury in a vacuum container as a cathode, which mercury was highly valued by ancient Chinese emperors. The Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huang, whose burial site is famous for the terracotta army, well, according to historical text, the emperor's tomb has an underground palace with rivers of flowing mercury. Why and how did they get so much mercury? Well, it would make sense that they were using it for these generators in order to harness electricity. They also conveniently refuse to unseal the tomb, as supposedly they are concerned about preserving the contents and believe that it's too dangerous to go down there, but I don't know if I believe that story. Seems kind of insane to build a porcelain tower like this in the 15th century, and there are many depictions of this one. But now the one standing today is just a replica. However, there are many more pagodas in this style which seem to be generators and not made just from wood. And I'm sure many of you guys remember the video of a temple where the top is collecting electricity and we see some type of light display. Well, what if that's what these structures were originally intended to be? Here are some more old photos, and I just find it interesting that many of these older pagodas are made of stone and have these spires at the top. It all seems more than just decoration, and if you look at the engravings of the porcelain tower, there used to be more to the device, which seems to have been these dangling bells, but perhaps they served a different purpose. And many of these older pagodas were probably stripped of this ancient tech when they were found. Pagodas are similar to minarets in many ways, and in some instances you can see the same spire and hanging wires. But let's go back to that board game, because since we're talking about ancient tech, there's something else I wanted to mention. On the cover, right by the caduceus, we see the Horn of Plenty, or the Cornucopia, which seems like a random reference to include on just a board game. Seems to be a pagan symbol associated with several Greek gods. but somehow this became a symbol for Thanksgiving? There's this interesting poster from 1876 that says, "California, the cornucopia of the world, room for millions of immigrants," which the cornucopia seems to be a symbol for abundance and prosperity, some type of horn that produces unending food, maybe some type of ancient frequency device that would increase or improve the growth of plants, something that could create an infinite supply of food. Interestingly, there's a book called The Mana Machine, which is based upon a translation of a section of the Zohar called The Ancient of Days, a machine that created algae as food for humans in biblical times. How did the Israelites survive their 40-year journey? Well, supposedly it was due to mana, but what if they had a machine that could generate this food, or a cornucopia? The Freemasons obviously thought this was an important symbol. And let's not forget the best Mandela effect of them all, which is the Fruit of the Loom logo, which supposedly never had a cornucopia, but for some reason we all remember it with one. Now I know this may be a stretch for many, but what if it has to do with this being some type of secret symbol or ancient device, that maybe somehow it was removed or we went to a reality where it's no longer the logo anymore, so that we wouldn't question it and look into its history? A cornucopia is far too random for people to remember with such vivid detail, so it does seem strange. But why is this on the cover? Is this some type of representation that this deal between Libertas, the United States, and the Chinese was going to produce unlimited amounts of money and prosperity? Well, there are several maps that show Fusang on the west coast that are of interest. There's a 1752 map that shows Fusang of the Chinese in Northern California. There's a 1776 map that has a Fusang on it saying it's a colony of the Chinese and is located near Vancouver Island. A 1778 map that shows Fusang of the Chinese. And there are a few others from the 1780s. But the excuse is that this was just a debated theory, that it wasn't accepted by the mainstream scholars. This idea that the Chinese colonized America in the 5th century was just a fringe theory. But then why do we see it on several maps from the 18th century? It makes more sense that they decided to remove this history because it didn't fit with their constructed false narrative of America. Now this gets strange because remember that poster that was talking about California accepting millions of immigrants? And we saw how the Chinese miners were also called master builders. Yet for some reason during the exact same time period, we have all these anti-Chinese riots. There was a Chinese massacre in 1871, which was a race riot when a mob of 500 entered Chinatown and attacked, robbed, and murdered Chinese residents. Interestingly, this took place in Calle de los Negros. Only 10 men of the mob were prosecuted, and the convictions were eventually overturned on appeal due to technicalities. In 1863, California passed a law that Asians could not testify in courts against whites, making them vulnerable to abuse and injustice. There was also the San Francisco riot of 1877, which was a violent riot aimed at expelling the Chinese immigrants in San Francisco by the city's white population, which resulted in the destruction of more than $100,000 of property belonging to the Chinese immigrants. There were many more of these riots in California and Seattle, and the story goes that it was due to the intense labor competition. That because the Chinese would work for cheap, that many other men were passed for employment, and the white population saw this as if they were being undercut by Chinese labor. Which seems like a very strange story. This is how the US and California repay the Chinese. Now all of a sudden they must go because they're taking all the jobs. In 1885, the Tacoma riot led to the forced expulsion of the Chinese population from Tacoma, Washington Territory, November 3rd, 1885. On November 3rd, 1885, a mob that consisted of prominent businessmen, police, and political leaders descended on the Chinese community. The mob marched Chinese residents to a railroad station and forced them to board a train to Portland. In the following days, the structure that remained in the Chinese community were razed. The event was the result of growing anti-Chinese sentiment and violence throughout the American West. So what's going on here? Were the Chinese in America before Columbus? Now remember, this is all thinking according to mainstream timelines, but this could all be far more elusive. Fusang could be a smokescreen of sorts. The date of the 5th century is according to mainstream timelines, and it makes more sense for this colony to be in America during the 16th century. This Fusang could have been a propaganda tool that was used for a certain period in the 18th century and 19th century to misrepresent the Chinese and Russian Tartarians that were already well established in the west coast of America. Meaning, California and the west coast was already populated, and up until the 1850s, they were against the powers that be. This is why the entire narrative of San Francisco and the gold rush makes no sense. How do you build up a city in less than 20 years like we see in the panorama? So cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, the reason why these cities were founded hundreds of years after their eastern counterparts was because it took time for the controllers to conquer them, because they were possibly inhabited up until the late 18th century. All of these cities, of course, after finally being taken over, went through some great fire event, and then the reset begins. Immigrants, which weren't the Chinese, but the new population of Europeans, were then moved into the west coast in these ghost cities. That's what the whole orphan trade movement was about, repopulating these newly acquired cities in the west coast. Another interesting facet of this involves Mexico. One of the traditional costumes of Mexican women is known as China Poblana, which means Chinese woman from Puebla. This was a popular dress during the 19th century in various cities in the middle and southeast of Mexico. So for some reason, the women who wore this dress were referred to as essentially Chinese women. They would call these ladies my China, and it is said that their partners were known as chinacos, who eventually became the Mexican charros. Interestingly, the first chinacos and their hats look like the Chinese farmer hats. These chinacos participated in many wars, but it's interesting that many of the natives in Mexico have an Asian appearance or slanted eyes. Is this just a coincidence? Of course, we're told this is because the Native Americans came over through the ice bridge during the Ice Age, but that's just mainstream history. If we consider the historical count of Fusang, along with many artifacts found in the West Coast and in Southern America, it would make more sense on why many of the Native Americans have an Eastern appearance. Were the Tartarians in America? The Tartarians in Chinese basically have the same yellow flag of a dragon with its tongue out. Now, I did want to honestly make this video longer, as I have something that connects with all this, but I thought it may be better to leave it for the next video. But don't worry, I basically have it all ready. I just think that I want to be smarter with how I do the videos instead of just putting everything into one long video. It may be better to separate them, so I plan on coming out with part 3 the next few days just to keep it rolling. If you liked the video, please share with your friends and let us know your thoughts. Is there anything else that we should look into? Thanks for watching, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?